Hello everyone, it's good to see you again. As you can see, I'm obviously in Egypt. I've been here for several shoots because it's a very inspiring place to study the evolution of human consciousness. The consciousness we have today, because we can put it into perspective, we can encounter other forms of consciousness, other states of consciousness. I love doing this. It's really a very educational and therapeutic approach for each of us, really awakening us and enabling us to rebuild ourselves. It's the perfect place for this kind of exploration, meditation, and reflection. And, I often talk to you about the artificial matrix, which is the vocabulary we can use to talk about this kind of mega system, this colossal memory energy which has been set up and which organizes things beyond the intelligence of a single person, and which gives us the impression that the march of the world is irremediable and that the mechanisms and processes that are behind everything we see in the world are beyond our control and that we are ultimately powerless to do anything about it. And if there's one place that can tell us about this, I think it's really ancient Egypt, because it shows us that this artificial matrix has already been at work. It's already been constituted to a large extent here, and that there have already been endings of cycles and endings of the world. And I find it interesting to study what happened in the past, how it happened, the sequence of situations, the solutions, the avenues, the attempts made by humanity to remedy this collective shipwreck, what worked, what didn't work. And that's the kind of place I like to come to bring you to, because when you see it from the outside, you can really look back in comparison. You can really look back at our time in the present moment and see things that are exactly the same processes that are quite similar. And I find it very illuminating and helpful. And in my little travel diary, I've taken note of signs and situations that, for me, were real markers of the fact that without a doubt Egypt was experiencing the end of a cycle, the end of times. And it really echoes a lot of what we're going through today. The first sign I noticed was the abandonment of the sacred. So you might immediately say it's de-Christianization, the absence of religion, the secularization of society, but that's not exactly it. I think this place is a very good representation of that, because for me, the abandonment of the sacred is something Egypt speaks to us about in its very history. You see, in the most ancient Egypt, the supreme value, the fundamental basis of an Egyptian's existence and identity is the certainty of having been created at the beginning of time by the gods. And that in the end, life is a succession of recreations, of reactivations of the founding act produced by the God at the beginning of time. So, for example, when a woman gives birth, she reenacts the first birth that ever took place. And therefore, she's linked to the goddess of childbirth, which is to say, the primordial principle of childbirth. When a man plants seeds in his field, he reenacts the first moment in the history of the world, when seeds were planted, when seeds were put in a field. When he harvests, he reenacts the first harvest of all times, and all of life is filled with the sacred. And the sacred, in the end, is the original founding act of what we experience. And I find this awareness, this way of seeing and experiencing the sacred very enlightening, very useful. And the sacred for the Egyptian was as simple, as universal, as natural as that. And we are gradually seeing a disappearance of the sacred, or rather, an appropriation of the sacred. And you see in temples like these, there were priests and priestesses who created and recreated these primordial acts. The first morning light, the first word spoken, the first water poured, offered to God. A whole succession of first acts were performed like original founding acts, from which all the acts of the people would resonate. And that was an appropriation of the sacred, because the sacred was taken away from the simple acts of everyday life to be imprisoned here in the temples. And the priests became the exclusive custodians, the owners with a large copyright over the primordial sacred acts that were de facto taken away and progressively, increasingly, denied to humans in their daily lives. In other words, they were going to tell humans to eat, raise children, work the land, turn wood, turn clay, make pottery. You see, all human natural activities, weaving, spinning, taking care of each other, were no longer sacred activities, because the sacred occurred exclusively in temples and sacred places with the gods and so on. And that to me was a sign of Egypt's gradual decline. And I think that today, in the de-Christianized West, we've gone even further. In other words, the sacred no longer exists. At the very least, it's conceded to you as a freedom of conscience. You are entitled to be a bit of a fool who believes in one thing or another, but the prevailing discourse with mainstream science means that it's a little fad at most, that we can tolerate, but it's no longer of any interest. And in all cases, the sacred must not invade the public space. And we must have no ostentatious sign of our sacred conviction. Public space must be sterilized from any expression of the sacred. This is really one of the signs that we're at the end of a cycle, the end of an era, for good. The second sign I noticed was the transfer of authority. You see, in a human culture, I was going to say, one that is normal, healthy, natural, there's a transfer of authority that we call education, but which we should rather call transmission. In other words, our grandparents, our parents, our big brothers, our big sisters pass on to us things that create within us a set of know-hows, behaviors, skills, attitudes that make us into functional individuals and that enable us to develop skills, strengths, qualifications for full participation in the collective life and in our personal lives. And there's a transfer, a living transmission that takes place. In ancient Egypt, we're seeing a shift from passing on our skills and know-how directly to our descendants to passing them on, for example. There is a gradual transmission of skills, a gradual transmission of skills to an administration, to legal texts, to obligations, kind of legal framework managed by an entity we'll call the government, for example. And it's the government that starts managing us and telling us what we should do, how we should be, what's acceptable and not acceptable. And in the end, we've made ourselves passive and submissive because authority has been handed over to institutions that are much larger than the family or the direct community. But it's a kind of entity, a collectivity, an unconscious collective that becomes the repository of authority and knowledge, and which must constantly tell us and call us to order about what's acceptable, what's not, what's legal, what's illegal, what we can do or what we can't do, what we can be or what we can't be. We've completely reversed the transmission from grandparents to parents to child with an appropriation of this transmission and its skills with a view to exercising them and passing them on. And gradually, it's the laws and all the, of course, law enforcement agencies, the agencies that control those who are the repositories of legitimate and legal violence. They're now the ones who become the repository authority for this transmission. And individuals are completely subservient to them. They are no longer educated and trained as free, sovereign and capable individuals, but are kept in a state of perpetual infancy and incompetence, and ultimately in indispensable submission for the glory and functionality of the community. The third sign of the end of a cycle, of the end of a culture, of a civilization, the end of an era, which can be detected as early as ancient Egypt, is the moment when the Earth's resources are envisioned and considered by humans, who are as if superhuman, who are as if detached from a direct relationship with the earth. You see, in Egypt, what happened was that beyond the borders of the Nile Valley, there were resources, copper mines, turquoise mines, metal mines. And gradually, Egypt did something it should never have done, which was contrary to its very philosophy. Since Egyptians considered themselves blessed by the gods living in the chosen land, the sacred land of the gods, they began to leave their country to take control of regions beyond their borders. In other words, they started doing what today would be called geopolitics. Out of national interest, they began to control territories, launch military campaigns, and appoint chiefs and kings in certain regions. It really was quite literally the imperial way. It was imperialism that emerged in Egypt, and this was made possible when certain beings began to manage resources, because you see, when you were a man, a woman in Egypt with a little plot of land in the valley, you had children, and so you had certain needs. You needed a certain amount of linen to make clothes, and you needed wood wheat, animals you see for breeding, and you had a direct relationship with the environment. In other words, you had a personal assessment of your concrete immediate needs. And so you had a certain amount of work and a literal need for matter and earth that corresponded to your actual experience. And there's a great restraint to it. When you take a step back and look at your territory as a head of state, as an engineer, as, you know, someone with a much more rationalized view of design anticipation, management, well then inevitably it's going to slide into management of resources, management of human beings. So you start to think of human beings as livestock, and for example you say, our demographic growth has to be upward because we need to have more demographic clout against our enemies. You see, you're beginning to have a vision of resources that's becoming extremely dangerous, leading inevitably to conflict and the use of the environment and human beings as matter. And you manage the population, and you have a kind of divorce between the immediate human experience and the thinking, the management of the rulers, the managers of a territory and the populations. And that's very, very obvious in ancient Egypt and was really their downfall, their fatal illness in the end. And then, of course, today it's commonplace. For me, a fourth, rather obvious sign of the end of a cycle that we can obviously see emerging in Egypt is the delegation of education. You see, in a natural society, children are educated by their parents, by their grandparents, by the whole community, and at a certain age a child will receive certain specific skills. So he'll go to a master blacksmith, a master carpenter, a breeder, a master horticulturist, a master fruit tree pruner. You see someone who has the specific skills to receive this education. And it's always in a kind of organic intelligence of the community. And when you delegate education, you standardize it. And at that point, all education is thought of, designed, taken over, and handed down by a much larger government with interests of its own. And you see, for example, if you live with your children in a small community, a small village, the child will, for example, also acquire a sense of justice. Rendering justice, having a fair assessment of situations, and being able to decide when there's a conflict. These are things that have been practiced by human beings since the dawn of time, in all human communities, in all civilizations. When education is delegated well, a certain system is put in place to, for example, suggest that a child study law, to become a lawyer, prosecutor, judge, and administer justice on behalf of the government. And at that point, the human being becomes utilitarian. That is to say, the child is conceived as potential material, a cog that can be placed in a whole, the whole, of course, of an artificial matrix that will be able to make use of him. Whereas, as long as education is directly with other human beings in an immediate environment, much more in touch with the real needs of a community, then you can't get into this kind of process. And I think that the delegation of education creates a divorce and a break between the generations, so that the younger generations see themselves as so much more intelligent and educated than their ancestors. And this creates a fragmentation of the transmission and coherence of a human society. A fifth sign that is very evident throughout Egyptian history is that of foreign invasions. I know you'll immediately think of mass immigration, but it's much more subtle than that and much more toxic. What one saw in Egypt then was when the country's elites became fascinated by cultures other than their own. In other words, they adapted the fashions, customs, vocabulary, tastes, and colors of foreign countries. Well, there's a kind of uprooting, a detachment that takes place, a void that appears between the people who are in direct contact with the land, with age-old traditions, with all the heritage that comes from the place, all the culture, the native, autochthonic civilization that comes from the land. That's the root of the Greek word, with an elite that's like in a kind of cloud in the stars, like that. And that's under the influence of something that doesn't come from its soil or its land. And that's really a sign because it's going to create a rift that's very, very difficult to repair between the ruling elites, the government, and the actual population. This is truly a sign of the end of times because it will create an irreparable separation and rift between the government and the aboriginal population who live in the transgenerational memories transmitted to them by their territory, by their soil, by their land. The sixth sign I've spotted identified here in Egypt is really the knowledge that, how would you put it? The soul is absent from knowledge. We used to say that science without conscience is but the ruin of the soul. In other words, when the soul, the heart, is absent from science, then science becomes a commodity that can be bought and sold. And we can see this very clearly here. For example, the architects and engineers have placed themselves totally at the service of a rather megalomaniac project, Pharaoh Ramses III's political communication project. And so science becomes, how shall we put it? It no longer has any moral obligation because it's obvious that when scientists work for the highest bidder, they have to declare all their discoveries first to the military or industrial complex. Look, this may remind us of something we've already seen here, namely that the artists who were trained to represent the gods, to lay down eternal writings that reach out to the cosmos, find themselves here depicting scenes that glorify acts of war and violence, hands cut off to express that such and such, a pharaoh crushed his enemies, cut off their heads, massacred them. It's really a kind of prostitution of knowledge. Every human being carries within them a heart and a conscience, and when the knowledge and know-how, that is the fruit of generations of effort and accumulation of mastery, come together. You can imagine the mastery here of geology, architecture, all the engineering it takes to make a building that lasts, that's been standing for almost 3,500 years. It's really been put at the service of a being for its political communication and then for its own glorification. It's pure megalomania to build a temple that lasts millions of years. To glorify the name of a person is an abuse of language and an abuse of knowledge and science. So for me, that's the sixth thing I've noted in my travel diary, the loss of the soul of science. The seventh, though it's certainly not the last, but the seventh I've noted, which is still very obvious, is when the authority then in Egypt, the pharaonic power, considered its population as a real resource. And it considered its country as a resource in a game of international geopolitics. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the game Risk. It's a game where you have a territory, a part of the world, and then you battle it out from territory to territory. And you see when people in government, in positions of power, who have the ability to anticipate, to manage, to think, to be more intelligent than average, gain access to positions of government of power. Well, from the moment they look at their country as part of a group of countries and a game of influence, they start looking at the number of inhabitants, their resources, the resources of others, and they enter into negotiations. For example, they enter into discussions at major international summits. This has always existed. There were embassies. The Hittites came here as an embassy, for example. There have been exchanges with other kingdoms. Geopolitics isn't really something new. So today it's called G20 BRICS, whatever you like, from the moment they get together and make little calculations, little reflections. I give you this, you give me that, I take that. We'll block this person for some such reason. That's when you become completely detached from reality, because you start to see human beings as something other than yourself. In other words, this kind of individual, obviously the ones who lived here saw themselves as far above other human beings, non-human, as quasi-gods. And so we enter into a kind of reflection with sentiments that are foreign to humanity, and we can make decisions that have nothing to do with what we, in the reality of our small, natural, normal human communities would do. We can then say things like, look, we're going to launch an offensive and it's going to cost us so many thousands of human beings, but we should be able to hold out for another 4 days. We're getting into considerations that are completely disconnected from reality. And for me, this is really a sign of the end of the cycle, because it means that what we managed to organize as a human society that could be functional with people with different skills, helping each other and exchanging their abilities to actually having transformed into a kind of artificial demon, of completely chimerical creatures. It's a golem. And I think what we're seeing here is the pharaonic institution becoming a kind of uncontrollable golem. Because, well, once again, when a pharaoh sees himself as a god who must be honored for millions of years and doesn't realize that in fact he's just one human body in an unbroken line of pharaohs, and that basically, as it was said at the beginning of Egypt, there's only one pharaoh from the beginning to the end of time. There is only one king, there are no kings. And there are men who serve this function. See, when this decorrelation takes place and human beings see themselves as completely superior to normal, real humans, then it's really a sign that this social organization is coming to an end. And it will be extremely difficult to go back and work with the same organism again. And that's what Moses experienced, for example. He saw that it was irreversible and decided to create another culture, another civilization on a different basis, on a different territory. It's this kind of reflection that I share with you in the travel diaries that I've put together in the form of a video which is currently being worked on and assembled by my whole team, and which we'll be able to offer you very, very soon. And of course, it's this kind of shared learning experience that we'll be experiencing during the initiatory trip to Egypt we're organizing in the autumn of 2025. I'm happy to have shared with you some thoughts from my little travel diary on these signs. I really wanted to show you how, from a certain point of view, we shouldn't be too afraid of what we are seeing either, even if it's pretty frightening what's going on in the world today. And how this artificial matrix is really taking apparent control of the situation. It's already happened, it already took place, yet humanity is incredibly resilient. There are solutions, and I'll tell you more about them, in all the notes I've taken on these trips to Egypt. And of course, I'll be telling you all about it on this voyage of initiation, and we'll be talking about it together during shared visits to sites, and also during conferences in this Nile cruise retreat format. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this moment I shared with you. Don't forget to give us a blue thumb to share this video, to leave us a comment and make suggestions on this topic. If there's anything you'd like me to talk about, I'd be delighted. You can write down your comments, my team collects all your testimonials, and we hold meetings to discuss future topics. Thanks again for listening, and a bright hello from here in Egypt.